Hi everybody, welcome to my channel Infinite Wish. I am I Infinite Wish. So today I'm going to be talking about moon in the 8th house synastry. So the moon in astrology, this is the part of you that feels, seeks comfort, very intuitive. It's how you react. Like the moon has different phases, right? So, with the moon, you're always shifting your emotions. You're trying to figure out what your hidden needs are. And it's basically like the vibe you give off when no one's really watching. And it's how you nurture yourself and others. The moon is really important because it's an emotional landscape of how you navigate every day, basically. It's a different side to your personality, and it influences your reactions and, how you find a sense of home to you in the world. And the 8th house, astrology, it's like a mysterious doorway, to secrets, transformation. It's like where you confront things that are hidden beneath the surface. It's also really important. Like, this is like a shared resources house, intimacy. And, the 8th house is a space that pushes you to evolve through crisis, secrets, and, connections. And the 8th house, I'm going to say, is not really about superficial surface. It's about really diving into the depths, because this house is naturally ruled by Scorpio. So the 8th house is like trying to find out what's real, what's raw, for the ultimate purpose of your transformation and your growth. And it's a very intense house. So, what happens when you have a moon in the 8th house synastry with somebody? So the moon can appear really confident, especially when they do approach 8th houser. And that's how they lead. They lead with their confidence, their emotional vulnerability, their openness, almost in a way that they lay their cards on the table. They may not tell you everything, but because it's in the 8th house, the moon just, feels comfortable telling them what they've been through, what their finances are like, and what their plans for the future are like, and this can be like, their first date or their first hangout, and, that can be seen by others as very refreshing, I guess would be the word I'd use. But, a lot of people will see this as you're emotionally dumping with confidence, and the problem with doing this is when somebody does that, you don't really know what their intentions are. I would say when you gradually get to know somebody and they open up, that's a different story. But if that's how they are leading, it's like you give information to get information. And, they may be comfortable sharing this stuff because they kind of want to. It's the 8th house. The moon's in the 8th house. And the moon wants to know your secrets, your traumas, because that's what the 8th house represents. What do you do for work? And they're trying to, I guess, gauge you. And yeah, so that's the one thing I would say. The moon, leads with confidence, emotional openness, and is really, really vulnerable to the 8th house. The moon can also be so nurturing. don't forget the moon also, naturally is under Cancer, and the moon represents the mother. So the moon could be really nurturing to the eighth house person, making them feel emotionally safe, and again, this can be the first time they're meeting. So what do I mean by this? Like, the moon can, automatically be wanting to hold eighth house person's hand, like just wants to, feel on them and do all this stuff. And, I wouldn't say it's like a lustful vibe. It's more like, the moon person wants to show eighth houser this is how they are in a relationship. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah. And the eighth houser may find this really refreshing. Like, they may feel relief. Like, thank God I don't have to pull so much emotional labor. Like, this is fantastic. Like, eighth houser may be kind of used to, doing emotional labor. So it could be really nice, a nice feeling, but, nice feelings don't really last long. So, and, the thing about that is eighth houser, may try to take advantage of that. Sometimes when you're in opposite positions, you could just be like, oh, I can never treat somebody like that. And when an opportunity presents itself to you, the eighth house person may want to do that. Maybe they don't even realize that, that they have that mindset, because if somebody does you wrong emotionally and stuff, normal people, the first thing is they don't want to do that to someone else, especially someone else comes into their life and, wants to date them and have a relationship with them. But some people, absolutely want to do that, and that's just how it is. So, eighth houser may not even be realizing that they're plotting to do that, or, they're kind of absorbing what the moon person is saying to them, how they're acting, what they're telling them. Yeah. So the moon here, like falling into somebody's eighth house, the moon just wants to see the eighth house person every day if they could, wants to talk to them all the time. They're very communicative. They, why aren't you talking to me? Why aren't you messaging me back? Or, this is something I'm not really comfortable with. Like, so that's how the moon is. Like, if they feel slighted or if they feel this, like, they're just open and they're going to tell you straight up, like, no, I feel like this is disrespectful. Like, would you want me doing this to you? Or, you know what I mean? And I'm going to say the reason why this happens is because it's triggering. The eighth house is very triggering. So for the moon to be sitting here, the eighth house person could just be acting in their shadow straight up, like, and this can be triggering to the eighth house, and this can also be triggering to the moon person. So they could just both be triggering themselves, and eighth house person just acting in their shadow, and the moon person may be like, the one thing I'd just be kind of careful about this is, the moon person can kind of dictate how they're feeling as a unit. That's where emotional lines can blur, like, oh, you're not like this, or, I don't think you're this kind of person because I feel like you're this kind of person, and that can be triggering for anybody. Nobody likes to be told, this is how you are. You know what I mean? Like, nobody really likes that at all. You know what I mean? So I don't really think this is like a moon and eighth house synastry thing, but that's just what can happen when the synastry manifests. So going back to what I said in the beginning, the moon person can most definitely lead with emotional confidence, but they could literally be crumbling, and either they let you know right away or they don't tell you. But for the most part, because it's following the 8th house, they can't help it. They will tell you exactly what happened with them. Like, for example, like the moon person could have went through A, B, C, and D, and then they meet you and they tell you what they went through, and you're just like, oh my God, like, no, because you have to be careful. You don't want to take on someone else's baggage. Again, this comes with emotional dumping. Everybody goes through things, but it's not someone's responsibility to make you feel better. You have to navigate that yourself. You have to learn your own coping mechanisms and stuff. You can't date someone in the hopes that they will make you feel better. You know what I mean? So, and then that's almost where the synastry can pull. At first the moon can be so, how like so into the 8th house person, making sure they're emotionally good and this and that. And it can flip because the moon changes. Like, there's different phases of the moon, and this synastry, like the moon can be night and day, right? And the moon can be offering help, like doing A, B, and C, and D for the 8th house person, running errands for them, taking them here, whenever the moon, the 8th house person calls them and says, can you do this for me? If the moon person isn't working or they're available, they will drop everything and go to the 8th house person. Almost like they make the 8th house person emotionally reliant on them, and yeah, the moon can be really manipulative in that kind of way. And again, the moon opening up, they want something from the 8th house person. They want the 8th house person to let them know what their secrets are, what their vulnerabilities are, And the thing about the moon person is the moon person can, I guess take a lot of emotional digs at the 8th house person, because maybe they pick up on things. If the 8th house person isn't willing to give them information, like personal information about their past traumas or their secrets or, anything that they went through or this and that, the moon person is just going to use the information that you told them. And they'll try to spin it in a way to see if you are vulnerable or not. So let me give you an example. So if the 8th house person was married and they got divorced with their significant other, but they're still living in that house because they're in the process of selling the house, and they're dating the moon person. The moon person, even though the 8th house person just said, yeah, it didn't work out, we're getting a divorce, and it's a clean divorce, like there's no issues there. The moon person is it's like, no, there's more things that you're not telling me. So they're gonna kind of emotionally dig. And they might dig and say, they might make fun of, if you guys have shared finances. They're just gonna try to find things to see what triggers you. But they'll make it in a way that's like jokingly, you know what I mean? Because you didn't really mention that those things triggered you as the 8th house person. So, it's the moon. The moon's going to try to figure that out on its own. And the 8th house person may struggle, like going back and forth, because they feel so triggered by the moon person. So they can stop talking to them, talk to them again, apologize, this whole back and forth. And it's like a show to the moon person, like it's almost, the moon person can kind of see where the 8th house person sits emotionally just by observing their behavior. So let's get into part 2.